Welcome to The Long Road Stories. Tonight, we bring you three real and chilling stories about phantom hitchhikers that appeared to truckers on American highways, encounters that defied all logic and left these drivers questioning everything they thought they knew about reality. Before we begin, subscribe to our channel and comment below telling us what state or country you're watching from. Now let's dive into three stories that will make you think twice before picking up strangers on the road. The Vanishing Woman. What would you do if you picked up a desperate, crying woman on a desolate highway at 3 in the morning? She warned you about a deadly accident miles ahead with specific details, and then completely vanished from your locked truck cab while you were driving 70 miles per hour down the interstate with no possible way for her to escape. Daniel Cooper had been driving 18-wheelers for 23 years, hauling freight across the southern states from Texas to Florida and everywhere in between. He was 49 years old, divorced with 2 grown daughters who worried about him spending so much time alone on the road. Daniel was the kind of driver who followed all the rules, maintained his logbook meticulously, never exceeded speed limits, and had never had a single accident or citation in over 2 decades of professional driving. He was known among dispatchers as reliable, steady, and completely unflappable. The kind of driver you could count on to deliver any load on time without drama or complications. On this particular October night, Daniel was hauling a load of furniture from Houston to Jacksonville, running along Interstate 10 through the lonely stretches of Louisiana where civilization seemed to disappear for miles at a time. It was 3:15 in the morning when Daniel first saw the woman standing on the shoulder of the highway, illuminated briefly by his headlights as he approached. She was wearing a light blue dress that seemed completely inappropriate for the cool October night, and she was waving her arms frantically, clearly in distress and desperately trying to flag down help. Daniel's first instinct was to keep driving, as he had been taught in his early training never to pick up hitchhikers due to the safety risks and liability issues. But something about this woman's desperate gestures and the complete isolation of this stretch of highway made him reconsider. There were no other vehicles visible in either direction, no gas stations or rest stops for at least 30 miles, and the woman appeared genuinely terrified rather than threatening. Daniel made a split-second decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life, gradually applying his air brakes and bringing his fully loaded semi-truck to a safe stop on the wide shoulder, approximately 50 yards past where the woman was standing. Daniel engaged his parking brake, turned on his hazard lights, and grabbed his flashlight before opening his door and stepping down from the cab. The October night air was cool and damp, carrying the smell of pine trees and swamp water from the surrounding Louisiana wilderness. He called out to the woman, asking if she needed help, and she came running toward his truck with obvious relief on her face. As she got closer, Daniel could see that she was probably in her mid-30s, with long dark hair that hung wet and disheveled around her shoulders, and her light blue dress was torn and muddy as if she had been through some kind of traumatic experience. Her face was streaked with tears and dirt, and she was shivering violently from either cold or shock or both. Daniel felt his protective instincts kick in immediately, and he asked her what had happened and if she needed him to call the police or an ambulance. The woman grabbed his arm with surprising strength and spoke rapidly, her words tumbling over each other in her obvious panic. She said her name was Catherine, that she had been in a terrible car accident about 2 miles back, that her vehicle had gone off the road into the trees, and that she needed to get help immediately because there were other people injured. Daniel was confused because he had not seen any sign of an accident on the highway behind him. No skid marks, no debris, no emergency vehicles, nothing that would indicate a crash had occurred. He asked Catherine how long ago the accident had happened, and she said it was less than an hour, that she had been walking along the highway trying to flag down help, but multiple vehicles had passed without stopping. Daniel felt guilty that other drivers had ignored her and told her to climb into his truck, where it was warm and safe, and he would call 911 immediately to report the accident and get emergency responders to the scene. Catherine climbed into the passenger seat of Daniel's truck, and he noticed that despite her wet hair and muddy dress, she left no watermarks or dirt on his seat, which struck him as odd but not impossible given the fabric of his upholstery. Daniel reached for his cell phone and was about to dial emergency services when Catherine suddenly grabbed his wrist and said with urgent intensity that there was no time to wait for an ambulance, that they needed to get to mile marker 237 immediately because something terrible was going to happen there in exactly 17 minutes. Daniel was taken aback by the specificity of her statement and asked her how she could possibly know that. And Catherine just stared at him with eyes that seemed far too calm and clear for someone who had supposedly just survived a traumatic car accident. She repeated that he needed to trust her and drive to mile marker 237 right now, and something in her voice made Daniel decide to comply, even though every rational part of his mind was telling him this situation made no sense. Daniel released his parking brake, checked his mirrors carefully, and pulled back onto the interstate, with Catherine sitting silently in his passenger seat. He kept glancing over at her, trying to understand what was happening, and he noticed several things that were increasingly unsettling. First, despite claiming she had been in a car accident and had been walking in the cold for nearly an hour, Catherine was not shivering anymore and showed no signs of shock or hypothermia. Second, when he turned up the heat in the cab to help warm her up, she did not react at all or move closer to the vents as someone who was cold would naturally do. Third, and most disturbing, when Daniel looked at his passenger side mirror to check for traffic, he could not see Catherine's reflection, even though she was sitting right there next to him, in perfect view of where the mirror should capture her image. Daniel felt his heart rate accelerating as he tried to rationalize what he was experiencing. Maybe the mirror angle was wrong, and that was why he could not see her reflection. Or maybe the dim lighting in the cab was creating some kind of optical illusion. He adjusted the mirror slightly and looked again, and this time he could clearly see the passenger seat, the door panel, the window, and even the small air freshener hanging from the vent. But Catherine herself was completely absent from the reflection, as if she did not physically exist in three-dimensional space. Daniel felt cold sweat breaking out on his forehead as he gripped the steering wheel tighter and forced himself to keep driving. Catherine continued to sit silently, staring straight ahead through the windshield with that same unnaturally calm expression, and Daniel was too afraid to ask her directly about the missing reflection or any of the other impossible details he had noticed. They drove in silence for several minutes, with Daniel watching his odometer and mile markers carefully, counting down the distance to mile marker 237. Catherine finally spoke again, and her voice was softer now, almost sad, as she told Daniel that he was a good man for stopping to help her, that most people would have driven past without even slowing down, and that his kindness was going to save lives tonight. Daniel asked her again to explain what was going to happen at mile marker 237, and Catherine turned to look at him directly with eyes that seemed to hold centuries of sorrow and wisdom. She said that a drunk driver in a pickup truck was going to cross the center median at high speed and cause a multi-vehicle collision that would involve at least 6 cars and result in multiple fatalities unless someone was there to prevent it from happening. Daniel asked her how she could possibly know this, and Catherine simply said that some people are given knowledge of future events so they can intervene and change outcomes that seem predetermined. As they approached mile marker 236, Daniel saw the marker ahead, illuminated in his headlights, and he began to slow his truck down, not sure what he was supposed to do when they reached the location Catherine had specified. She told him to position his truck across both lanes of the interstate with his hazard lights and high beams on, creating a barrier that would force any approaching traffic to stop before reaching the dangerous section of highway ahead. Daniel knew this was extremely dangerous and technically illegal, but something about Catherine's absolute certainty made him trust that this was the right action to take. He brought his fully loaded semi-truck to a stop at mile marker 237, angled it diagonally across both lanes to block the entire width of the highway, activated every light on his vehicle, and prepared to wait for whatever Catherine had predicted would happen. Daniel turned to ask Catherine what they should do next, and the passenger seat was completely empty. She had vanished without a trace, disappeared as if she had never been there at all, and Daniel was now sitting alone in his truck in the middle of the interstate, with no explanation for what had just happened. He immediately checked the passenger door and found it was still locked from the inside, with no way Catherine could have opened it and exited without him noticing. Daniel felt panic rising in his chest as he searched his entire cab, looking in the sleeper berth, checking the floor, examining every space where a person could possibly hide. But Catherine was simply gone, having somehow dematerialized from a locked truck traveling at highway speed. Before Daniel could process the impossibility of what had just occurred, he saw headlights approaching rapidly from behind his truck, at least 6 or 7 vehicles that were forced to slow down and stop because his semi was blocking the entire highway. Drivers began honking their horns and flashing their lights, obviously angry about the obstruction. And Daniel grabbed his CB radio to broadcast an emergency warning to any truckers in the area. He explained that there was a dangerous situation ahead and that all traffic needed to stop immediately, even though he had no rational way to explain how he knew this or why he had blocked the highway based on the instructions of a woman who had subsequently vanished into thin air from his locked truck. Approximately 3 minutes after Daniel had stopped his truck at mile marker 237, exactly as Catherine had predicted, there was a horrific crash visible about half a mile ahead. A pickup truck came flying across the center median from the opposite side of the interstate, its headlights spinning wildly as it flipped through the air, and it slammed into the guardrail on Daniel's side of the highway before erupting in a massive fireball that lit up the night sky. If Daniel had not blocked the highway when he did, if those 6 or 7 vehicles behind him had been allowed to continue at normal highway speed, they would have been in the exact location where the pickup truck crossed over and exploded, and Catherine's prediction of multiple fatalities would have come true. Daniel called 911 and reported the accident, and within minutes the area was swarming with emergency vehicles, fire trucks, ambulances, and state troopers. The driver of the pickup truck was killed instantly, and toxicology reports would later confirm he had a blood alcohol level more than 3 times the legal limit. The Louisiana State Police questioned Daniel extensively about why he had blocked the highway moments before the crash occurred, and he struggled to explain the encounter with Catherine without sounding completely insane. He told them he had picked up a woman who warned him about an accident that was about to happen, and when they asked where this woman was now, Daniel had to admit she had vanished from his truck in a way that defied all physical laws and logical explanation. One of the older state troopers listened to Daniel's story with an expression that suggested he had heard something similar before, and after the other officers had finished taking statements and measurements, this veteran trooper approached Daniel privately and asked him to describe the woman in detail. Daniel told him about the light blue dress, the long dark hair, the apparent age of mid-30s, and the intense calmness in her eyes. The trooper pulled out his phone and showed Daniel a photograph from a case file, asking if this was the woman he had picked up. Daniel felt his blood turn to ice as he stared at the photograph and confirmed that yes, this was absolutely the same person, identical in every detail, from the blue dress to the facial features to the expression in her eyes. The state trooper explained that the woman in the photograph was named Catherine Marie de la Cruz, and she had died 18 years earlier in a single vehicle accident at mile marker 234, less than 3 miles from where Daniel had picked her up. Catherine had been driving home from her nursing shift at a hospital in Baton Rouge when her car hydroplaned on wet pavement and crashed into the tree line, and she had died instantly from her injuries. Since her death, there had been at least 47 documented reports from drivers who claimed to have encountered Catherine on this stretch of Interstate 10, always late at night, always in distress, and always warning about accidents that subsequently occurred exactly as she predicted. Some drivers had picked her up and experienced her vanishing from their vehicles, while others had simply seen her standing on the shoulder and had later learned about accidents they had narrowly avoided by choosing different routes or timing their trips differently. Daniel Cooper continued driving trucks for 3 more years after his encounter with Catherine, but he never again traveled that particular stretch of Interstate 10 through Louisiana at night, always planning his routes and schedules to avoid mile marker 237 during the dark hours when Catherine's ghost was most active. He kept a copy of the photograph the state trooper had shown him, not because he needed proof that the encounter was real, but because he wanted to remember the woman who had used him as an instrument to save lives, even though she had been unable to save her own. Daniel never doubted that Catherine was genuinely trying to help people, that her spirit remained tied to that highway because she had been unable to prevent her own death and now dedicated her existence to preventing others from suffering similar fates. Sometimes, late at night, when Daniel was driving through particularly isolated areas, he would think about all the ghosts that might be out there on America's highways, spirits of people who died too soon and remained to watch over travelers who never knew they were being protected by forces beyond the physical world. Comment your state or country and tell us the most haunted stretch of road near you. The best ones might appear in the next episode. The repeating passenger. Imagine driving the same route every single night for work, and at the exact same mile marker, you see the exact same hitchhiker standing in the exact same position with the exact same gesture. And every time you pass without stopping, your truck mysteriously breaks down within minutes. And this happens 7 nights in a row until you finally stop on the 7th night, only to discover the hitchhiker has been dead for 20 years and you have been seeing a ghost trapped in an endless time loop. Frank Martinez was a 52-year-old local delivery driver who worked the night shift transporting manufactured goods between 2 warehouses located approximately 80 miles apart in rural Missouri. Unlike long-haul truckers who traveled across multiple states, Frank drove the same route every single night, 5 nights per week, taking Highway 63 north from his starting point in Jefferson City to his destination near Columbia. The drive usually took about 90 minutes each way, and Frank had become so familiar with every mile of this route that he could probably navigate it with his eyes closed, knowing every curve, every hill, every landmark along the way. Frank had been doing this exact same run for 7 years without incident, and he prided himself on his perfect record of on-time deliveries and mechanical reliability. But during one particularly strange week in late November, Frank experienced something that shattered his rational worldview and made him question everything he thought he understood about life, death, and the nature of reality itself. On Monday night, as Frank drove north on Highway 63 at approximately 11:45, he passed mile marker 66 and noticed a figure standing on the shoulder of the road. It was a man who appeared to be in his 60s or 70s, wearing faded blue jeans, a red flannel shirt, and a brown jacket, and he was holding out his thumb in the universal gesture for hitchhiking. Frank barely gave the man a second thought, as he passed hitchhikers fairly regularly on this route and had a strict personal policy of never picking up strangers due to safety concerns and company regulations. Within 5 minutes of passing the hitchhiker, Frank's truck began making a terrible grinding noise from the transmission, and multiple warning lights illuminated on his dashboard. He managed to limp the truck to the next exit where there was a 24-hour truck stop, and the on-call mechanic diagnosed a transmission sensor failure that took 2 hours to repair and cost Frank his perfect on-time delivery record for the first time in 7 years. On Tuesday night, Frank drove his repaired truck along the same route at the same time, and at exactly mile marker 66, he saw the exact same hitchhiker standing in the exact same position, wearing the exact same clothes and making the exact same gesture. Frank thought this was an unusual coincidence, but still did not stop, following his standard policy of never picking up hitchhikers under any circumstances. Within 10 minutes of passing mile marker 66, Frank's truck experienced complete electrical failure. All his lights went out, including his headlights, and he found himself coasting to a stop on a pitch-black highway with no power to any of his systems. It took over 4 hours to get the truck towed and diagnosed, and the mechanic could find no logical explanation for why the entire electrical system had suddenly failed when all components tested as functional. On Wednesday night, Frank began to feel a sense of dread as he approached mile marker 66, and sure enough, the same hitchhiker was standing there in the exact same position with the exact same appearance. Frank passed him again without stopping, but this time he paid closer attention to details, noting that the man did not turn his head to follow the truck as a normal person would, did not show any reaction to being passed, and simply remained frozen in that hitchhiking pose, as if he was a statue rather than a living human being. Within 15 minutes of passing the hitchhiker, Frank's truck suffered brake failure. Fortunately, on a flat section of highway where he was able to use his emergency brake and downshifting to bring the vehicle safely to a stop without causing an accident. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore, and Frank began to suspect that somehow the hitchhiker and the mechanical failures were connected in a way that defied rational explanation. On Thursday night, Frank decided to conduct an experiment. He approached mile marker 66 slowly, and as expected, the hitchhiker was there in his usual position. Frank deliberately pulled his truck over onto the shoulder approximately 100 yards before reaching the hitchhiker, and he sat there with his engine idling, watching in his mirrors to see what the figure would do. The hitchhiker did not move, did not walk toward Frank's stopped truck, did not show any awareness that a potential ride had pulled over. He simply stood there, motionless, at exactly mile marker 66, as if he was tied to that specific location and could not deviate from it. After watching for nearly 10 minutes, Frank put his truck back in gear and continued past the hitchhiker. And this time, he made it almost 30 minutes before his truck's engine suddenly seized without warning, requiring a complete tow and an engine rebuild that would take 3 days to complete. Friday night brought the 5th encounter, and Frank was now driving a loaner truck while his regular vehicle was being repaired. He thought maybe the problem was specific to his usual truck, and that driving a different vehicle might break whatever curse or connection seemed to exist. As he approached mile marker 66 in the unfamiliar truck, his heart sank when he saw the same hitchhiker standing in the same position, and Frank knew with absolute certainty that passing him again would result in another mechanical failure. Sure enough, less than 5 minutes after passing mile marker 66, the loaner truck's steering system locked up completely, nearly causing Frank to lose control on a curve before he managed to wrestle the vehicle to a safe stop on the shoulder. The mechanic who examined the loaner truck found that a critical steering component had somehow sheared completely through, a type of failure that should have been impossible given the component's age and condition. Saturday night was the 6th encounter, and Frank was now starting to research the history of Highway 63 and mile marker 66, looking for any information that might explain what he was experiencing. He found several old newspaper articles from 20 years earlier about a fatal hit-and-run accident that had occurred at mile marker 66, where a hitchhiker named Robert Coleman had been struck and killed by an unknown driver who had never been identified or brought to justice. The newspaper described Robert as a 68-year-old man who frequently hitchhiked along Highway 63, and the photograph accompanying the article showed a man wearing blue jeans, a red flannel shirt, and a brown jacket, identical to the figure Frank had been seeing every night. Frank felt chills running down his spine as he realized he had been encountering the ghost of Robert Coleman, a spirit apparently trapped at the location of his death, and doomed to repeat his final action of trying to hitch a ride for all eternity. That Saturday night, Frank approached mile marker 66 with this new knowledge weighing heavily on his mind, and as always, Robert's ghost was standing there in his eternal hitchhiking pose. Frank passed him once again, still too frightened and uncertain to actually stop, and within 20 minutes, his truck's fuel system mysteriously clogged, causing the engine to sputter and die, even though his fuel gauge showed 3/4 of a tank, and the fuel itself tested clean when examined by mechanics. Frank was beginning to feel like he was being punished for not stopping, as if Robert's ghost was causing these mechanical failures as revenge for being ignored, or perhaps as a desperate attempt to force someone to acknowledge his existence and pick him up after 20 years of being passed by countless drivers who never stopped. Sunday night was the 7th encounter, and Frank made a decision that terrified him but felt absolutely necessary. He was going to stop and pick up Robert's ghost, even though he had no idea what would happen when a living person allowed a dead person into their vehicle. As Frank approached mile marker 66, he saw Robert standing there as always, and this time, Frank gradually slowed his truck and pulled over onto the shoulder directly next to the ghostly figure. Frank sat there with his engine running, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears, and he leaned over to open the passenger door from inside the cab, calling out that he could offer the hitchhiker a ride if he needed one. Robert turned his head to look directly at Frank, and their eyes met for the first time across all 7 encounters. The ghost's face was sad and tired, with eyes that held 2 decades of loneliness and frustration, and he slowly walked toward the open passenger door of Frank's truck. Robert climbed into the cab with movements that seemed both solid and ethereal at the same time, as if he existed in multiple states of reality simultaneously, and he settled into the passenger seat with a sigh that sounded like wind blowing through empty spaces. Frank asked him where he needed to go, following some instinct to treat this supernatural encounter as if it was a normal hitchhiking situation. And Robert replied in a voice that sounded distant and echoing that he just needed to get home, that he had been trying to get home for so very long. Frank put his truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway, driving north with a ghost sitting next to him in the passenger seat. Robert began to talk, and his words came out slowly, as if he was remembering how to form language after years of silence. He explained that he had died at mile marker 66 20 years ago, struck by a speeding vehicle whose driver never stopped or reported the accident, and Robert's body had lain on the shoulder of the highway for nearly 8 hours before anyone found him. He said that his spirit had been trapped at that location ever since, compelled to stand there night after night, trying to hitch a ride, unable to move forward or backward from that exact spot, existing in a kind of loop where he relived his final moments over and over without end. Robert said that hundreds of drivers had passed him over the past 2 decades, but Frank was the first person who had actually stopped and offered him a ride, and that act of kindness had broken the cycle that had held him prisoner. As they drove, Frank noticed that Robert's appearance was becoming less solid and more translucent, as if the ghost was slowly fading away or transitioning to some other state of existence. Robert said he could feel himself being released from the highway, that whatever force had kept him tied to mile marker 66 was finally loosening its grip, and he thanked Frank repeatedly for being brave enough to stop when so many others had driven past without a second glance. Robert said his actual home was in Colombia, about 15 miles ahead, and he asked if Frank could drop him off at the exit for Business Loop 70, where his wife and daughters had lived 20 years ago when he was still alive. They drove in silence for several minutes, and Frank could see that Robert was becoming more and more transparent, his form starting to shimmer and flicker like a fading television signal. Robert suddenly said that Frank had been experiencing those mechanical failures all week, because Robert's spirit had been unconsciously lashing out in frustration and anger, affecting the physical world around him because he was so desperate to be acknowledged and helped after 2 decades of being ignored, Robert apologized for the problems he had caused and said that Frank's vehicles would experience no more mysterious breakdowns now that the curse had been lifted. As they approached the exit for Business Loop 70, Robert asked Frank to pull over one final time, and he said he could make the rest of the journey on his own from this point forward. Frank brought his truck to a stop on the shoulder near the exit ramp, and Robert opened the passenger door and stepped down from the cab. He turned back to look at Frank one last time, and his face showed an expression of profound peace and gratitude, the face of someone who had finally been released from a terrible burden. Robert said that Frank was a good man for stopping when he did not have to, that this act of compassion had freed a soul that had been suffering in limbo for 20 years, and that Frank would be protected on the highways for the rest of his driving career because he had helped someone who desperately needed help. Robert's form became completely transparent, and then he simply faded away into nothing, vanishing into the November night like mist dissolving in sunlight, finally free to complete whatever journey awaits spirits when they are released from their earthly attachments. Frank Martinez never saw Robert's ghost again during the remaining years of his career as a night delivery driver. He passed mile marker 66 hundreds of times on his regular route, and the Hitchhiker was never there, the spot now empty and ordinary, with no trace of the supernatural presence that had haunted it for 2 decades. Frank's trucks never again experienced the mysterious mechanical failures that had plagued him during that strange week, and he became known among his fellow drivers as someone who had the best vehicle reliability in the entire fleet. Frank never told many people about his encounter with Robert Coleman's ghost, knowing that most would dismiss the story as fabrication or delusion. But he kept the newspaper clipping about Robert's death folded in his wallet as a reminder that the world contains mysteries that science cannot explain, and that sometimes the greatest gift we can give another person, living or dead, is simply the acknowledgement of their existence and the willingness to help them find their way home. The wrong ride. Picture yourself picking up a friendly traveler who makes pleasant conversation for hours as you drive through the night, and then you casually glance at your mirrors and notice that your passenger has absolutely no reflection whatsoever. And when you pull over in a panic and call the police, they review your dashboard camera footage and inform you that you have been talking to yourself the entire time, that nobody ever got into your truck, and that the door opened and closed by itself while you carried on a conversation with empty air. Gary Williamson was a 43-year-old independent owner-operator who ran his own small trucking business, hauling refrigerated goods across the Pacific Northwest. Gary had purchased his truck 5 years earlier after working as a company driver for nearly 2 decades, and he took enormous pride in being his own boss, setting his own schedules and building a reputation for reliability and professionalism. Gary was generally a solitary person who enjoyed the long hours alone on the road, listening to audiobooks and podcasts, thinking about his life and his goals, and appreciating the independence that trucking provided. He rarely picked up hitchhikers, partly because it was against most insurance policies, and partly because he simply preferred his own company to making small talk with strangers. But on one cold January night in Washington state, Gary made an exception to his usual policy, and that decision led to one of the most disturbing and inexplicable experiences of his entire life. Gary was driving north on Interstate 5 through a particularly desolate stretch of highway between Olympia and Seattle, hauling a load of frozen seafood that needed to reach its destination by morning. It was approximately 1:30 in the morning, and the road was nearly deserted, with only occasional vehicles passing in the opposite direction. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and light snow was beginning to fall, creating conditions that made Gary glad he was driving a well-maintained truck with excellent tires and traction. As he approached a rest area, Gary noticed a figure standing near the entrance ramp, a man who appeared to be in his mid-40s, wearing a heavy coat and holding a duffel bag, clearly hoping to catch a ride with someone willing to stop. Gary's first instinct was to drive past without stopping, following his standard policy regarding hitchhikers. But something made him reconsider. The weather was getting worse, the temperature was dangerously cold, and this rest area was at least 20 miles from the nearest town, meaning the man would be stranded in potentially life-threatening conditions if nobody helped him. Gary made a split-second decision to pull into the rest area and offer the man a ride, at least as far as the next major city where there would be warmth and shelter. Gary brought his truck to a stop near where the man was standing, and he leaned over to open the passenger door, calling out to ask if the man needed a ride north. The man's face lit up with obvious relief and gratitude, and he jogged over to the truck, tossing his duffel bag into the cab before climbing in himself. He thanked Gary profusely, explaining that he had been stranded at this rest area for nearly 3 hours after his car had broken down and been towed, and that he was trying to get to Seattle where his sister lived and could help him figure out his next steps. The man introduced himself as Michael, and Gary thought he seemed pleasant and normal, just someone who had experienced some bad luck and needed assistance. Gary pulled back onto the interstate and continued north, and Michael settled into the passenger seat, making comfortable small talk about the weather, the trucking industry, and life in the Pacific Northwest. For the next hour and a half, Gary and Michael talked about various topics, and Gary found himself actually enjoying the company and conversation. Michael seemed intelligent and well-informed, asking thoughtful questions about Gary's experiences as an owner-operator, sharing stories about his own work as a software developer, and discussing current events with nuanced perspectives. Gary thought it was nice to have someone to talk to during the long night drive, and Michael seemed like exactly the kind of low-risk, appreciative hitchhiker that made stopping feel like a good decision rather than a dangerous mistake. They talked about their families, their dreams, their regrets, and all the small details that people share when they are passing time together on a long journey. As they approached the outskirts of Tacoma, approximately 2 hours into the drive, Gary glanced at his passenger side mirror to check for traffic before changing lanes. What he saw in that mirror made his blood run cold and his heart skip several beats. Gary could see the passenger seat clearly reflected in the mirror. He could see the door panel, the window, the seatbelt, and even Michael's duffel bag sitting on the floor. But Michael himself was completely absent from the reflection, as if he was invisible or did not exist in physical space. Gary blinked hard and looked again, certain his eyes were playing tricks on him or that the mirror angle was somehow distorted. But the absence of Michael's reflection was absolute and undeniable. Gary felt panic rising in his chest as he tried to remain calm and not reveal what he had just discovered. He glanced over at Michael directly, and the man was sitting right there in the passenger seat, looking completely solid and real and normal, gesturing with his hands as he continued talking about something related to his work. Gary looked back at the mirror, and once again Michael had no reflection whatsoever, existing in direct vision but not in reflected surfaces. Gary's mind was racing as he tried to understand what this could possibly mean, and he began to notice other unsettling details that he had somehow missed during the previous 2 hours of conversation. Michael had never touched anything in the truck except his own duffel bag, never adjusted his seatbelt, never rested his arm on the door or window, never made any physical contact with the vehicle's interior surfaces. When Gary had offered Michael some water from a bottle in his cup holder, Michael had declined, saying he was not thirsty, and Gary now realized that Michael had not drunk anything, not eaten anything, not even cleared his throat or coughed or made any of the small physical sounds and actions that real humans do unconsciously. Michael's breathing was silent, producing no fog on the cold window next to him, despite the temperature difference between the heated cab and the freezing exterior air. Gary tried to maintain his composure and continue the conversation normally, while his mind worked frantically to figure out what to do next. Was Michael actually a ghost? Was Gary hallucinating? Had he somehow fallen asleep at the wheel and was now dreaming this entire bizarre scenario? Gary subtly checked his GPS and confirmed that he was exactly where he should be on Interstate 5 approaching Tacoma. And everything else about his truck and his surroundings seemed completely normal, except for the fact that his passenger apparently had no reflection and showed no signs of physical interaction with the three-dimensional world. Gary decided he needed to get to a public place with other people as quickly as possible, somewhere he could get help or at least verify his own sanity. Gary told Michael that he needed to stop at the next rest area to use the facilities and check his truck, and Michael agreed pleasantly, saying he could use a break as well. Gary took the exit for a large rest area that he knew had 24-hour facilities and good lighting, and he pulled his truck into a parking spot near the main building where several other trucks and cars were parked. Gary told Michael he would be right back, and he grabbed his phone before jumping down from the cab and walking quickly toward the rest area building. He looked back at his truck and could see Michael still sitting in the passenger seat, visible through the windshield, apparently waiting patiently for Gary to return. Gary found a quiet corner of the rest area and called 911, knowing he was about to sound completely insane, but not knowing what else to do in this impossible situation. He explained to the dispatcher that he had picked up a hitchhiker who appeared normal but had no reflection in mirrors, and that he was worried he might be experiencing some kind of medical or psychological episode and needed assistance. The dispatcher remained calm and professional, asking Gary questions about his location and condition, and she promised to send a state trooper to his location immediately to check on his welfare and assess the situation. Within 15 minutes, a Washington State Patrol trooper arrived at the rest area and approached Gary, who was still standing outside near the building, keeping his truck in visual range, but not wanting to return to the cab with Michael until help had arrived. Gary explained the entire situation to the trooper, describing how he had picked up a hitchhiker named Michael, how they had talked for hours, and how Gary had eventually noticed that Michael had no reflection in the mirrors and showed other signs of not being physically real. The trooper listened carefully without judgment, and he asked Gary to walk with him back to the truck so they could investigate together. As they approached Gary's truck, the trooper shined his flashlight through the passenger window, and Gary looked in, expecting to see Michael sitting there waiting. But the passenger seat was completely empty, with only Michael's duffel bag sitting on the floor as evidence that anyone had ever been there. Gary was confused and insisted that Michael had been sitting right there just 15 minutes ago when Gary had gotten out of the truck, and there was no way Michael could have exited the vehicle without Gary seeing him leave, as Gary had been watching the truck the entire time from his position near the building. The trooper asked Gary to open the truck so they could examine it more thoroughly, and they discovered that the passenger door was locked from the inside, meaning nobody could have exited through it without unlocking it first. The sleeper berth was empty. The entire cab was empty, and there was no sign of any passenger except for the duffel bag on the floor. Gary insisted he was not making this up, that Michael had been real and present and had talked to him for over 2 hours during the drive from Olympia, and the trooper said he believed that Gary believed what he was saying, but that they needed to check the truck's dashboard camera to see what had actually been recorded. Gary's truck was equipped with a forward-facing dashboard camera that recorded continuously while the vehicle was operating, and the trooper asked permission to review the footage from the past few hours. Gary agreed immediately, certain that the camera would show Michael getting into the truck and sitting in the passenger seat during their long conversation. The trooper took the camera's memory card and reviewed the footage on his patrol car's laptop computer, and what he found was so disturbing that he called for backup from a supervisor before showing Gary what had been recorded. The footage showed Gary pulling into the rest area where he had first encountered Michael, and it clearly showed the passenger door opening by itself with nobody visible entering the truck. For the next 2 hours of driving, the camera showed Gary talking animatedly and gesturing as if he was having a conversation with someone, but the passenger seat remained completely empty throughout the entire drive, with only the duffel bag visible on the floor. The footage showed Gary looking over at the empty passenger seat repeatedly, nodding and responding to things nobody was saying, carrying on a detailed two-way conversation entirely by himself. Finally, the footage showed Gary pulling into the current rest area, the passenger door opening by itself again, and Gary exiting the truck alone while the empty passenger seat remained empty. Gary watched the footage in horrified disbelief, unable to reconcile what the camera had recorded with his vivid memory of talking to Michael for hours. The State Patrol supervisor, who had arrived as backup, suggested that Gary might have experienced a rare psychological phenomenon called a sustained hallucination, possibly brought on by fatigue, isolation, or some other factor that caused his mind to create a detailed imaginary companion. They strongly recommended that Gary see a doctor before continuing to drive, and they offered to arrange for his truck and load to be transported by another driver while Gary got medical evaluation. Gary Williamson voluntarily submitted to a comprehensive medical examination that included neurological scans, psychological evaluation, and tests for everything from brain tumors to carbon monoxide exposure to early-onset dementia. Every single test came back normal, with no medical explanation for why Gary had experienced such a vivid and sustained hallucination of a passenger who did not exist. The duffel bag that had been left in Gary's truck was examined by police and found to contain clothing, toiletries, and personal items. But none of the items could be traced to any specific individual, and there were no identifying documents or labels that might reveal who Michael really was or had been. Gary eventually returned to driving, but could never shake the disturbing memory of those 2 hours spent in conversation with someone or something that existed only in his perception, and left behind only a mysterious duffel bag full of generic belongings as evidence of its presence. Sometimes, late at night, when Gary was driving alone through isolated areas, he would find himself talking out loud as if someone was listening, and he could never be completely certain whether he was truly alone in his truck or whether Michael or something like Michael was sitting in the passenger seat, invisible and reflected in nothing, listening to every word and thought that Gary projected into the darkness of the cab. Thank you for watching the Long Road Stories. Subscribe for more true highway encounters and comment below telling us where you're watching from. The highways hold more mysteries than we can imagine, and we'll be back soon with more stories that challenge everything you thought you knew about the open road.